Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Baldur's Gate 3, as we all know, is a game packed with secrets, but even to this day, what we didn't get is what fascinates me the most. Entire storylines, companions, and mechanics were completely built, voiced, and sometimes almost finished, but then were quietly scrapped before the game's full launch. From missing character arcs to lost companions that were never able to speak a word, today I want to discuss some of this cut content with you. Just quickly, all my sources for this video are in the description if you are curious and want to look more into these. Also, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subbing to the channel and dropping a like, and without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, the first piece of cut content I'd like to discuss is surrounding the illithid worm that you can of course consume for power in the game. From the moment that the parasite takes root in the final version of the game, only your own struggle with it is really explored. But what if I told you that your companions were also meant to wrestle with the struggle of it themselves? Well, in datamine files for the game, Larian left traces of a cut system, where each companion would accept or reject the so-called illithid gifts independently of your own character's choices. Just imagine if Will or Shadowheart began speaking to you about their dilemmas with the tadpole, not because you yourself forbade them from its power, but because of their own internal struggles with it. That level of agency with the companions is of course absent from the game's final version, and I honestly think it could have made for some interesting fractures within the party surrounding the tadpole beyond just whether they have good approval ratings with your character. It's actually even possible to see remnants of this cut system as a bug, where companions will wake up after a long rest and claim to have received a gift from their guardian, despite not unlocking any powers at all. I personally really do wish this stayed in the game, as the nature of these decisions could definitely have changed some dynamics within the party. For example, imagine if Gale cautiously began to experiment with the powers of the illithid, while Lae'zel, who is struggling with her pride as a Githyanki, is tempted to wield the power, but terrified of what it could do to her. Small moments like this would have for sure added something great to the game's camp dynamics, especially early on, and I hope someday that a modder can get this restored in some form. Right in the heart of the Underdark sits one of the game's most enigmatic characters, Omeluum, and originally he was supposed to provide you with a ring that would have completely changed the nature of your tadpole. Essentially, in the early access version of the game, a ring provided to you by Omeluum would have provided you the ability to completely block the tadpole entirely, and I mean stopping it from growing, providing you powers, or having any sort of progression. So this would mean that the parasite that you consume for powers would entirely be suppressed, and all the gifts that come with it would be locked to you for the entirety of the game. That shift is of course massive. Whereas in these early versions, this ring was supposed to be a hard counter to the parasite's influence, in the game's release version, it's just a partial shield and not a solution in itself. What's interesting is that fragments of this more powerful version are actually present in dialogue with Omeluum, as he'll still state that the ring blocks the influence of the absolute, despite the fact that in the game it actually doesn't. Of course, if the stronger version of this item still existed, it would definitely have changed the nature of your use of the illithid powers. To me, it's plausible to suggest that some quests could have entirely changed or become pointless if your parasite never actually progressed, and the reactions of your fellow companions would have also been quite interesting. But of course, the version of this item in the actual game is simply a shell of its original version, as Omeluum just provides you with a watered down ring that will only prevent you from being charmed. Honestly, I really do think this is one of the most interesting pieces of cut content in the entire game, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it down below. Now, this is for sure one of the most tragic pieces of cut content in the game. This cut content is actually a cut companion known as Helia, who would have been a halfling bard affected by lycanthropy, which is essentially a condition that makes you turn into a werewolf. For me personally, this actually seems to be one of the most fleshed out pieces of cut content in the entire game, as in the files, Helia has over 770 voice lines logged. So it's pretty clear that her character wasn't simply a concept or a sketch, but a deeply planted character whose story was unfortunately never able to bloom. In her voice lines, we can find her making several quips about Selune, her distrust for moon goddesses, and overall it was quite clear that she was written into the game's party banter, NPC reactions, and companion conversations. In fact, one line from Astarion actually explicitly mentions her in regard to the taste of her blood, tying her existence into the usual tension between vampires and werewolves. She was initially coded to be imprisoned in her wolf form in the goblin camp, tormented by children pelting rocks, giving us a brutal and sympathetic introduction to her character. Her character would have for sure added to the game's overall party dynamic, as if she had made it in, she would have filled multiple missing characteristics amongst the party. This is from being the only short race companion, a bard, and also a character living with her duality as a werewolf. I honestly always did wonder why there was no bard companion in the game, as it would have provided much to the game's party, and I guess we now know our answer why. To be honest, this cut content is definitely the one that stings the most in this list, especially because it was more than just a simple concept, and it's saddening to know we missed out on what could have been one of the most compelling companions in the entire game. You may have noticed when playing as a cleric that the option to select from the Dead 3 as your deities is absent. Well, originally they were actually supposed to be an option, and you were indeed able to worship a god from the Dead 3, either it be Baal, Merkel or Bane. In fact, some special dialogue did exist in the game for a player who played as a paladin and then multi-classed at least one level of cleric on top and selected one of the Dead 3 as their deity. Of course, this cut content is huge, as it wouldn't have just provided flavor to your character's origins, but it would have woven your spiritual allegiance into dialogue, NPC reactions, and even possibly into the narrative itself. Instead, in the final version of the game, the Dead 3 do exist in the game's lore and narrative, but never as a faith you yourself could embrace. Now just think about how choosing to worship one of these deities would have impacted your relationships with certain characters. Imagine telling Shadowheart that you serve Baal, or Gale challenging you and your potential faith in the Absolute as a result of your worship of one of the Dead 3. The weight of your character's faith could have definitely helped to peel back some characters in the game in unexpected ways, and it's one of those cuts I really wished remained in the game in some form. Whereas currently your chosen deity honestly barely impacts the narrative or even the dialogue of the game, the integration of the Dead 3 as choices for deities as a cleric could have possibly become a central part of your journey within Faerun. Although I don't know if it's possible, I really do hope that one day the game's talented modding community will be able to restore this choice in a potential cut content mod. If you've ever watched another one of my videos, you'll be familiar with my unfortunate distaste for Halsin's character. But what if I told you that Halsin was actually supposed to have much more to his story? As we know Halsin in the game's full version, after you help him find Thaniel, his story pretty much vanishes entirely, and he really has no impact or dialogue in Act 3 beyond very minute interactions. Well, Datamine content actually suggests that Halsin was supposed to have additional endgame content, specifically involving the Druidic circle, of which would have provided him a much bigger role in Act 3 of the game. Even more recently, Datamine dialogue was even found in relation to this, hinting at a possible heated argument between Halsin and Jaheira. This conversation supposedly would have involved talks about betrayal, loss, and the Harper's supposed abandonment of the Shadow Cursed lands. Honestly, conversations like this that were cut could have reframed Halsin not simply as a guide and a companion with a one-note arc, but as a flawed, almost vengeful protector of nature possessing regrets and resentments. This would have dramatically added to the game's narrative, as just imagining Halsin being cornered by his own guilt and torn between his druidic duty and the losses he carries would have made him much more endearing as a character. I also really personally like the idea of the tension between the two druids we have in our camp, as it's something that I think definitely would have added to the characters of both Halsin and Jaheira in a great way. Of course, what we got instead was Halsin being one of the most boring characters in Act 3, who despite his potential honestly feels devoid of any real stakes, relationships, or personal burdens. And to me, that's the real tragedy of his character, because if he had played a larger role past Act 2, I genuinely do believe he could have easily become one of the better companions in the game, but instead he ends up being the weakest of them all. Something that I always found strange in Baldur's Gate 3 was the story surrounding the character Mole. Now, Mole's side quest is one that seemingly promises darkness, death, and escape, but in the final version feels very much unexplained. The quest of finding Mole includes you tracing her abduction, her contract with Raphael, and eventually her path through the city of Baldur's Gate. But what we unfortunately don't see is the potential full arc that was planned behind her contract, and the answers to questions such as what her deal with Raphael entailed. In Datamine content of the game, it's been found that the final portion of Mole's quest involving Raphael was actually cut, which is the reason as to why her escape feels so abrupt. In the full release of the game, the real, scripted resolution to her story with Raphael is absent, and because that leg of her narrative was removed, her story feels like a subplot with no real conclusion. I honestly do wish this remained in the game in some way, as it would not have only added to the depth of this side quest, but to the character of Raphael himself. Just think about what would happen if you had to confront Raphael and take back the contract, or had to force a moral choice on Mole's potential death. Instead, you'll simply find Mole in Act 3 as though nothing had happened, and it's never explained to us exactly how she escaped. To me, it's a piece of cut content that can definitely be felt, as the threads of a larger story are there, but the weaving is just incomplete. It's a shame really, because Mole's story should have been gritty and painful, but what we got instead is just a ghost of what could have been. Minthara is for sure one of the most polarizing companions in all of Baldur's Gate 3, but despite that, I never found her character all too interesting for most of the game, and I attribute much of that to her great lack of content. As you only recruit her at the end of Act 2 like Jaheira, she doesn't have much room to develop, and she doesn't even get her own companion quest like almost every other party member in the game. That's why I find it even more unfortunate that according to the Datamine content in the game's files, her arc was actually supposed to be much richer than what we get in the final release. In fact, there are actually cut dialogue dialogue lines about a child or pregnancy, and a larger story thread that suggests she would have carried more emotional burden than just her fiery ambition for conquest. What's actually super interesting about this one is that in the game's final patch, patch 8, some of these cut lines actually resurfaced, as if you killed Minthara and then casted Speak with Dead, she would reference wanting a home for a child. Now almost immediately this was removed from the game, and it's clear that it was accidental, but it does make you wonder what was originally supposed to be there, and what would Minthara's story be if she was torn between loyalty to the Absolute and her primal duty of motherhood. More about this cut story thread can also be seen in the files, with companion reactions and more personal dialogue also being present, painting a character arc that is much bigger than what we actually got. Personally, I think it's likely that this was unfortunately cut due to the fact that Minthara's character as a whole was added late into the game's development, and so her arc wasn't able to have the time to fully flourish. Again, much like the cut content surrounding Helia, this one definitely stings, because to me, if any one companion needed more room to breathe and evolve, it definitely should have been Minthara. Arguably, this next piece of cut content is the most significant among this list, and one that you can undoubtedly feel in the final release of the game. Of course, I'm talking about the thousands of cut lines of dialogue from Act 3. If you've seen my big Baldur's Gate 3 critique from a couple weeks back, you'll know that one of my biggest problems with the game's final act is in fact the lack of companion reactivity and dialogue that exists in Act 3. And this sentiment can all be confirmed by the fact that much of your companion's dialogue in Act 3 was cut from the final release due to time constraints. And no, these weren't simply throwaway lines or quick reactions, but rather many of these were fully voiced, tied to unresolved quests, and responses to some of the most significant choices in the game's final stretch. It's honestly a bit sad to think about, because all of these exist in the game's files, and all these potential conversations we could have had with our companions in the game's largest act are all just absent. And really, I don't think anyone can deny the emptiness posed by this in Act 3. Whereas in the game's first two acts, the companions' banter, worries, and quarrels were always prevalent, in Act 3 much of this is replaced with just silence or quick one-liners. It often feels to me that in many of the game's biggest choices that occur in Act 3, your companions' reactions are just muted, and more importantly that their relationships with each other almost falls to the wayside. It's for this very reason why Act 3 can feel hollow in terms of your companions' interactions, and I often do wonder how different the game's final stretch would be if these cut lines were restored in full. One of the characters I've always personally thought had a bunch of wasted potential is the vampire master himself, Cazador. He's a villain whose shadow looms large over Astarion's entire character arc, but unfortunately much of his original role in the story was actually cut from the game. In the actual game, we know Cazador as Astarion's vampire master, the one who binds him and one who demands obedience. The ritual that Cazador commences during your encounter with him requires thousands of souls, much of which was delivered by Astarion himself. But despite the decision you make here, whether to help Astarion fight off his master or to give him in, the game doesn't really have anything to provide you in response. Well, originally, Cazador was actually supposed to play a much larger role in Act 3, and this is directly tied to another piece of cut content, the Upper City. As a matter of fact, Cazador's story was supposed to be the story of a powerful political figure in the Upper City, and perhaps even a reluctant ally in your final push against the Absolute. Again, this is another one of those things I really wish stayed in the game, as Cazador as he currently is not exactly an interesting or developed character. But if we had gotten a larger narrative surrounding his manipulation of the people and his strategic political plays, Astarion would not only have to confront his former master, but a powerful political force within the city. Honestly, just imagining the possible political intrigue, blackmailing, and betrayals just makes me think of a much more expansive arc, one that not only would be a personal showdown for our companion, but an encounter that would shape the city as we know it. For the final entry on this list, it's one that I think all of us wish made it into the final release. As it currently stands for me personally, much of the dramatic fights in Act 3 kind of feel underwhelming, and I think a lot of that is as a result of how far you've progressed to this point. Now, what if I told you that your encounter with arguably the most terrifying of the three chosen, Orin, was supposed to be much different than what we got in the full game? Well, according to cut content, the boss fight with Orin was actually supposed to be a fight with her corrupting a Githyanki red dragon, turning it into a nightmarish boss that you'd face in your final climactic battle in Baal's temple. Not much else is known about this piece of cut content besides this, but honestly, it's one of the most disappointing omissions in the entire game. Just imagining fighting against a properly corrupted red dragon, unleashing terror in one of the game's most climactic fights has me hyped, and I think many of you would agree. Orin's fight to me is the one with the most potential for sure, and I think that Larian definitely could have capitalized on it if they went with this cut idea. Because yeah, it's cool that she goes into her Slayer form and you fight her in Baal's temple with your companion's life on the line. But unfortunately, it never feels as dramatic as the game wants it to be, and it could easily be max level by the time you even get to the fight. For me personally, in my very first playthrough of the game, I was able to kill Orin just with Lae'zel's first turn, using Action Surge and some bonus actions. And to be honest, this made what could have been one of the best boss fights in the game something that really could have been just any other side boss. Anyway, let me know what you think about this down below. Do you think it should have been kept in the game? And if so, why? And with all that said, that wraps up my discussion of some of the cut content in Baldur's Gate 3. Much like my prior cut content video, I had a lot of fun reading up and writing up this video, and if you enjoyed, please let me know down below, as I would love to cover even more cut content that we know of. Again, as I stated multiple times in the video, it's really a shame that a lot of these things were cut, and although the game is still incredible even without them, they definitely would have added something substantial to the game overall. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. If you enjoyed, please consider subbing to the channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and RPG content, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.